The Game Boy Advance wasn't my first console, but it was the one I purchased with my own money, so it has a special place in my heart. I worked all summer picking fruit in an orchard, rain, hail or shine. I did have other consoles that I share with my siblings, but I wanted something for my very own. I wasn't old enough to go to the midnight release in June 2001, but my mother, who I gave the money to, went and purchased it for me the next day. I did ask for the launch purple, but she came home with the glacier. I forgive you, Mum. I didn't want this color at the time, but it's my favorite now. Now saying all that, we're going to rip this apart and give it an AliExpress glow up, give it a new shell and a new backlit LCD screen, and probably print a nice pattern using our UV printer. Let's rip in. Let's get a last look at this screen before we upgrade it to the backlit version. Can you guess what game this is? Hint, it's a release title. Geez, I can't wait to play this game on the new screen. There's 7 screws holding this casing together, and in Nintendo style, they haven't used a standard screw, but they've used a tri-wing screw. I really struggled to take the screws out with the provided screwdriver. I probably should have bought a precision tool set. Spoiler alert, I did. When dealing with small parts, I always like to have a container close by to collect them. These are slippery little suckers. Once you get the 6 tri-wing screws out, there's actually a normal screw, a Phillips head one, hidden in the battery case in the back. Once that's removed, you can see the motherboard. We have a 32 ribbon cable screen, which is one of the older Game Boy Advances. The new ones have 40 pins. You need to remove the rest of the screws holding the motherboard in place to get access to the screen and the rest of the buttons. Once this is done, you disconnect the screen ribbon cable by pressing the connectors latches at the top here. I love seeing the inner workings of retro tech, seeing all the components clearly marked. It's much easier to repair electronics back then. Saying that, this is my first time attempting a Game Boy Advance upgrade, and I'm an amateur solderer at best, so what could go wrong? Now that the motherboard's separated, I want to test a new screen before we put it all together. To attach the screen to a driver board, put both on a flat surface and gently press the connector together. I'd like to take this time to say there is other great tutorials out there on YouTube to watch that I learnt this from. I'll put the links to those in the description below. Watch those after this because we're going to print on the case and I reckon it's going to turn out pretty good. Now the screen's attached to the driver board, we need to connect that ribbon cable to the 32-pin motherboard. Now we need a power source, and there's 2 ways to do this. You can put the motherboard back in the case and put 2 AA batteries in the back. This is probably the easier version if you don't have a power source. But I had a power source, so we hooked that up, and you should have it at 3 volts and between 100 and 130 milliamps. I had this slightly over on both of them. Lucky it still works. Now I know that the screen works, let's get to designing the external shell. I should also mention all the parts I've purchased on AliExpress and other places I'll put in the description below, so you can check them out later. I chose a black shell because I wanted to keep the design simple. First thing that came to my head was something Nintendo related. I first thought maybe we'd do a pattern of mushrooms or little question marks. You know, the boxes Mario jumps up with his head and gets a concussion. Ultimately, I didn't like the direction this was going in. I don't know about you, but seeing a building-sized rocket caught with chopsticks inspired me maybe do a SpaceX design. I was looking at the top of the rocket, the Starship, and there's a heat shield, and it looks like a hexagon, and I thought this could be a cool pattern. So that's what we're going with. I wasn't the first person to come up with this product. Tim Dodd, the everyday astronaut, had a really cool beach towel with this exact heat shield tile pattern on it, but he's not selling it anymore. If you're a space nerd and love merch, especially space merch, you should check out his store. It's quite good. I'll chuck that in the description below as well. I also put the SpaceX logo on there for good measure. There's really nowhere else to put it besides in the center below this Game Boy Advance logo. Before we print this pattern on the shell, there's a few things we need to do to prep it to make sure that it will print well. First thing we need to do is create a jig so the shell can sit evenly in the UV, because if it's off an angle, it won't print well and it'll jam the printer. The way I made this jig was firstly tracing the outside of the shell using the Shaper Trace, which is an app and a product that ultimately converts drawings into scale vectors that make it easy to cut or route out. I've done an in-depth look at this product. If you want to check that out, go to my page, but do that later, of course. I took the vector that was made on the Shaper Trace and chucked it into Illustrator to neaten up the path so it would cut well on the laser cutter. Then I proceeded to cut out a test piece just to make sure that it was the same size. You always got to check these things. And no surprises, it was perfect. Now I can go on to making the jig. And once we had the exact size of the Game Boy cut out, we can make the jig out of acrylic, which I've done off screen. The next step is to wipe the bonding agent all over the shell so the ink can stick really well and makes it much more durable, because this thing is going to be played with. I did the primer dry, and then we got to mask off the areas we don't want the pattern to print. This is all around the edge, which I use masking tape. And then for the little parts, I had to use my Cricut to cut out little stickers to stick into the speaker vents and where the logo and power buttons are, so that doesn't print in there. And we chuck it in the UV, and let's watch a time lapse of UV printing. I'm really happy how it's looking up to this point. Peeling back those masks and revealing how schmick this print looks is giving me a really false sense of confidence, and I'm about to get humbled in the next step. Now this is where I really stuff things up. I thought I was being a real clever little lad by using color-coded wires so that I wouldn't muddle up which wire I was soldering where. But the issue was the gauge of wire I had was way too big, and it caused a big issue when trying to put the case back together. Also, the thing I stuffed up, soldering in the wrong spot on the L&R bumper buttons. This caused the screen to get locked in a different display setting, which I managed to resolve. When I was putting the shell back together, forcing it because the wires were so thick, I broke something, and I just couldn't figure out which component I broke. I went over everything, cleaned the Gameboy down with icy propyl, pulled it all apart, and I couldn't find any connections that were broken. The thing was just dead. Now you might think I was going to throw this out and it's a waste of a whole Gameboy. It's not. If you've seen those frames where they have a tear down of a Gameboy, I've always wanted to do that. So I'm going to do that with these spare parts. Let me know in the comments if you want me to record it. I'm going to do it anyway, but if you want me to record how I do that, I can do a video on that too. I had to order a new Gameboy, which delayed me a little bit. So here it is in the post. Let's get into it. Geez, this Gameboy looks like it's been in the wars. Let's crack it open and get inside. This was much easier to open with the new Precision Screwdriver Set from the LTT store. I did in about the third the time it took me with the screwdriver supplied with the kit, and the magnetic tip on the screw made it just so much easier I didn't lose screws. This Gameboy Advance is a 40-pin connector, and if you had a sharp eye you might have noticed I dumped a bit of footage in from this motherboard in the beginning. Once apart, the motherboard looked a bit dirty, so I got one of my children's old toothbrushes to clean it with a bit of icy propyl. Normally there'd be an over-chewed toothbrush my wife's I could use, but she seemed to have replaced that, so kids one it is. Now that's clean, let's skip past connecting of the screen. We showed that earlier in the video, and let's go right to soldering the wires onto the control board for the screen. I took screenshots from the Handheld Legends how-to video so that I wouldn't stuff up again. I'll put that video in the description. I really don't want to make this mistake again and have to replace all these parts for a second time. Before soldering these parts on the screen, I just added a little bit of flux with this flux pen to help the solder stick. I have to say, soldering the smaller wires was much easier than I thought. I was very surprised. It didn't take much solder at all, and they just hooked on straight away. Now I'm using all the same coloured wires. I just put a bit of tape on the L bumper button so that I wouldn't get them all mixed up. Because we were soldering the select before we put the case on, there's only 2 left, so I just didn't need to mix up 2 wires. Now the 3 wires are secure. I got a bit of double-sided tape and stuck the control board to the back of the screen and put the insulated film over the back of the screen. As now I'm about to put the screen in, I just thought I'd put a microfiber cloth down to protect the screen. Didn't want to get it damaged at this late stage, so that's why you're seeing this bright orange microfiber cloth. Next I have to put the double-sided adhesive tape that holds the screen in place in. I left the middle of it in to help keep the integrity while sticking this around. I still had to use a little blade to neaten it up, but it did its job. Now that's in, I have to put all the buttons in before putting the motherboard back on top. Make sure you don't forget the little piece of plastic where the LED power light is. I nearly forgot to put the insulating foam in as well, which goes behind the screen. Now the motherboard's screwed in place, I need to solder the L and R connector wires. And again, that was surprisingly easy compared to the thicker wires. And then we've got to connect the screen back to the motherboard, and I loosely put the shell back on and put some AA batteries in to do a quick test. Big sigh of relief. It all works, even the brightness dimming using select and the bumpers up and down worked perfectly. Now it's time to put all the screws in and put the Gameboy Advance fully back together. And whilst I was doing this, I managed to knock the glass screen protector on the floor and crack it. Lucky I had a spare one. The only slight issue is that this one is smaller, as it's for the original Gameboy Advance without the backlit screen, so it has a tiny bit smaller viewing area, but it's not really noticeable, and if it annoys me, I'll change it in the future. Now it's all together, it's time to let my son have a crack at it. He loves retro games, especially old Nintendo titles. And as he's playing Mario Kart, he turns to me and goes, geez, this is much harder than the Switch. I'm like, yeah, mate. Games used to be harder back in my day. Now for some beauty shots. I'm extremely happy with how it turned out. And if you guessed Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 for that game at the beginning, you were right. Well done. My mother-in-law also dug out my wife's old Game Boy when she was a child. Let me know if you want me to do a mod of that. Again, I'll probably do it anyway, but can make a video at it if you're interested. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you stick around for some more of my videos in the future. And if you're not, subscribe.